Hello and welcome. On behalf of the Association of Professional Chaplains, I thank you for joining us today for our APC webinar, The Effects of Trauma Exposure on Chaplains. I am pleased to introduce our presenter, Alexandra Zareth, MDiv, BCC. Alexandra Zareth is finishing her PhD in Marriage and Family Therapy at Eastern University. She is an alumna of Princeton Theological Seminary in Princeton and of St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas. She is an ordained Christian minister who serves as the Associate for Leadership Development and Recruitment of Leaders of Color with the Presbyterian Church. Alexandra has served as staff chaplain for Einstein Healthcare Network in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and is a member of the trauma medical team, as well as the director of national programs at Esperanza. Both positions enabled her to partner with leaders all over the country to create and implement leadership institutes and experiential learning opportunities for clergy and lay leaders that serve diverse communities. Alexandra has worked with local community entities to co-found relevant programs and nonprofits in multiple communities that serve to address emerging needs. Having also served in the violence prevention and intervention field for 15 years, Alexandra is committed to empowerment, education, leadership, development, and healthy living. A brief question and answer session will follow the presentation. You may type your questions into the Q&A area at the bottom of your screen at any time. Thank you all for your attention. I would now like to turn the conference over to our presenter, Ms. Alexandra Zareth. Please begin.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. This is an exciting time. My hope is certainly to share with you a little or a lot of what I've been working on the last couple of years. And although my hope is certainly to share what I can that will help you as chaplains, I want to sort of fully disclose that my area of studies has been about everybody that's in the medical team and firefighters with cops, people who are exposed to trauma on a daily basis or because of their job. And so that's certainly open conversation topics, and I welcome that. I also want to sort of just kind of say that I know that I am talking to you, and my goal would have been that we can have a more interactive space. And so I want to say that from a pedagogical shift here that I want to do and really encourage you to use the Q&A during my conversation here, because I just want to give credit to my Latin American roots, and we really, really believe that educational growth and development of all of us comes through community and conversation. And so it really, really happens best when it's en conjunto, when it's together. So if you have access to the Q&A section, which I believe you do, then please, I encourage you to talk to me in that format throughout the conversation, and then certainly we'll cover Q&A at the end. But I'm also aware that sometimes, as it was in my former workplace, I mean, we put the computer in the middle and I'll just sit around. So I get it, and I want to be flexible, but really I just want to invite you to lay the questions out as they emerge, because that's really valuable. So you can find me on my Gmail account. You can find me on LinkedIn. I tend to be pretty good about response time. And so for whatever reason you're completely disappointed because you really wanted a long lecture for 70 minutes and you feel robbed, do not blame APC. I take full responsibility for that. And so I can certainly hope to have any conversation moving forward as we move along. I hope that I am able to be heard okay. It sounds like somebody's saying that the sound is not coming in too consistent. So I'll slow down. Maybe that'll help. So please use the Q&A like someone already has. So thank you. Here are some of the learning objectives, and maybe some objectives, other things will emerge as we spend our time together. But I really want to expand our understanding of trauma. In some spaces, I know that we define trauma in particular ways, and so we're going to talk about how we understand it. I'll talk a little bit about what are the symptoms related to trauma exposure. And what I mean by trauma exposure and the researchers that I've been working with and looking into is when you see it all the time, when you work in the emergency room, when you serve the domestic violence world, when you work with refugees, and every day you are hearing their story, their journey. And so you're consistently exposed to that. So that's different, obviously, from being triggered in your work because maybe there's previous trauma. And that's different from having complex trauma. I mean, it's just a little bit different. So that's what I mean by trauma exposure. And we'll talk about how it affects us as practitioners. And we'll talk about ways that protect ourselves from the effect of trauma exposure, which is really important if we want to do this work well. I want to preface by sharing a story that when I went up for board certification, I was already working in a trauma level 1 hospital, and I was working in the emergency room and with women and babies, which meant I really only saw infant death. So between infant death and a Philadelphia hospital where there's a lot of homicides, I had quite the amount of work that was pretty traumatizing and exposing me to a lot of trauma. And I was asked, how long do you think that you can do this work? And I remember pausing and wondering what the right answer was because I really wanted to get board certified. My job depended on it. And I could come up with a rebuttal to either saying, yes, I can do this forever, or saying, no, I don't know that I can keep doing this. And so I said, I don't know. And the people who were there when I came back and they said, oh, congratulations, we're going to board certify you. One of the chaplains said, I'm glad you didn't know because I don't think you know what happens. And I remember it sat not well with me, but it also, in retrospect, recognized what wisdom spoke to me that day and how grateful I am that he sort of gave me a little bit of a warning and a lot of inspiration to do my work. So heads up, if you get these kind of feedbacks, listen, because the wisdom is there with the people who have done this work before us. So thank you for the committees that do that work and if you participate in that. So I will share some stories. And, you know, in law and order fashion, I want to make sure that we know that although we might recognize some situations, some characters in the story might look familiar, they do not depict anything, and I don't mean any disrespect to anyone. So I will start with Officer Hop. Officer Hop, as some of you may or may not, well, you're not supposed to remember, but she is a police officer in a big area called Zootopia. She comes from a big family. She's very extroverted. She is the first one to sort of go to school, get away from home, and lives out there. And so one day, Officer Hop handled a domestic call. In that domestic call, there was a death, the death of a female, and her husband had killed her. So she worked with the perpetrator, saw the victim. She knows that the kids, they had some children and they were at school when all of these things sort of went down. And, you know, one day she's just kind of feeling it. She's sitting at her desk and she's really kind of feeling it. So her BFF, Officer Wild, says, you know what, you're just such a softie. Let's go get a drink. And so they do. And they have a good time. But eventually she gets home. And she's home alone, and she's just kind of, you know, she had fun, but she's alone now, and she's sitting there in her chair, full uniform and all, and she's kind of replaying the scene, and she's wondering who told the kids, and she's really like, wow, I come from a stable family home. And so she really wonders what that feels like and where the children are sleeping tonight because the scene is probably still getting processed. And again, who told the kids? How did they tell the kids? I mean, this is just a lot. Then suddenly her phone rings. Oh, it's her mom and dad. So she rolls her eyes. She puts on a smile, answers them on FaceTime, and says, yes, everything's great. Thank you. So it went. There's other people, right? This is a woman named Marge. Maybe she looks familiar, but you don't know her. She was fairly unsatisfied in her marriage, and she began online school a few years ago, and she finally left her alcoholic husband, and now she's a single parent. She is the sole breadwinner in her household, and she loves being a nurse because she gets to be 3 days on and 4 days off. And so she's working the holiday weekend, so she's not going to be with her kids for Christmas. And there she is working. A 10-year-old autistic child with asthma is being brought in by EMS. She hears the call and the haste, and she's got the next open bed, so she's going to get it. EMS is actively doing compressions. Everyone does their very best. They try so long. They try for such a long time. And unfortunately, the child still doesn't make it. And so Marge goes home, and she looks at her special needs child, and she's just like so sad, just so, so sad. And now it's been a while since that case, and Marge just keeps remembering the EMS compressions. Like, she did compressions. She could feel the ribs breaking when she was doing it. You know, she could hear almost the loud wailing of a mother. The siblings kind of really looked like the patient. It was just a lot. It was just a lot. And so one day, Marge notices that her scrubs don't quite fit the same, you know, and she's kind of had a migraine for a long time, not sure how long, and she's just not motivated. And her sister told her, her loving sister told her, you kind of look zoned out. And she's like aimlessly staring at the kids. And she's got this son who's kind of a troublemaker. And one day he gets into college, and she's just like, oh, okay. And if that sounds familiar, when you have a special son like Bart Simpson, I mean, if he gets into college, that would have been a win. But it's not. So, you know, just kind of makes you think. Here's this other guy, you know, big guy, non-traditional family. You know, he's changed his ways. His family really encouraged him to change his ways. He went to medical school. He is now a successful emergency room physician. And one day, there he is talking to the chaplain on the side while the trauma doctors are evaluating the patient, because he had to level the patient because of the kind of medically traumatic things that he had. And so he's just mad, right? And he's talking to the chaplain, and he says, this jerk just needs to stop drinking so he won't fall down the stairs and use up a hospital bed and medical resources that he would never appreciate because he's being a completely useless member of society. So, you know, he wasn't always like this. He does remember a time years ago when he would enjoy reading to the kids, and he knows he's jaded. And he knows that he feels that there is no hope for humanity at this point. That's just how he feels. And he feels sad for his family because his oldest child got a very different father than like his youngest child. And so what he used to enjoy, which is working on the house and stuff like that, his man cave, I mean, he just kind of hides in it when he gets home. And he's continued to attend all of the family functions and, you know, but he's really learned to sort of silence his real thoughts, and definitely feels like he has to drink in order to prepare for the BS that he encounters. I'm giving you guys time because I think some of these stories are sounding maybe familiar. Like, we've heard them, I think. Here's Judy. Judy always worked great with people, and she found herself helping everybody. So she decided that maybe this social work would be a good field for her. So she did an internship. She got the job at the hospital after that with benefits. Everything was great. Unfortunately, she covers a lot of different areas, and they include the emergency room. And, you know, on this day, she just had to find placement for 5 adolescent kids with mental illness. She had to submit 3 child abuse reports to the department that handles that in her state. She did meet 4 survivors of assault, and she supported a family who had homicide in their family. And then, you know, there she is ending her day, and she gets home, and her longstanding partner had surprised Judy when she got home today because, surprise, it's her birthday. And so her house was full, and there was a cake, and she got a gift, and she gets to go to the Super Bowl next year. So Judy inhales very deeply, and she attends her own party, and as soon as everybody leaves, she absolutely goes off on her partner. In what universe would it make sense to celebrate like this? You obviously don't know me at all. I'm glad you had time to go plan this crazy. I don't even have a chance to pee. I don't even know why I tried to make this work. Then the fight, then the breakup, and so it goes. Fred does environmental services at the hospital, and he's really good, and he's really quick. And so he often gets the trauma bay. And so, he's been working. And Fred, really, honestly, he's pretty chill, has a very good attitude. He cleans after patients and families and staff. And he's just really been looking forward to his sandwich. He left it in the fridge. It was his leftovers. He has an episode of The Walking Dead or maybe Game of Thrones. And it's just ready. And so he's really excited about that. So he finishes his shift. He gets home. He opens the door and steps on poop, which only means that Pebbles forgot to take the dog out. Then Bam Bam and Pebbles, of course, have an unfinished science project, and it's crucial that they go to the store immediately to buy material. And so what happened to his leftovers? Someone definitely ate them. So he's mad. He's appropriately mad. And unfortunately, Wilma isn't home because it was Wednesday, and she went with Betty to Bible study. And so, needless to say, when Wilma gets home, it's just fireworks. It's just fireworks. So these people and their stories, obviously they're cartoons. But are their stories not that dissimilar from ours, maybe? I think I am comfortable saying that after researching this topic for the last 5-6 years now, we are not that different. You are not that different. And so you are definitely very, very special. But the reality is that trauma does affect us. Trauma affects us deeply. And so we need to expand what we mean by trauma, because sometimes the hardest things that we see are not always in the trauma base. So those of us that have worked in the medical space, we tend to minimize anything that's not a medical trauma, because the hospital tends to focus a lot of energy around being a trauma, like level 1 versus level 2, and among other things they focus on. But I certainly feel that often we shift and we're like, well, it wasn't like a trauma. You just got your leg cut. It's not a big deal. And it was far enough and there was no artery, so you're not really a level 1. And so we end up confusing our own brain. But sometimes the hardest thing is not what we saw in the trauma bay. So trauma can be anything that's deeply disturbing, distressing. It causes a sense of horror and helplessness. It can be extremely surprising. If there can be threat of serious death or injury, then you can be traumatized. It can be sudden, usually unexpected, because your brain's not ready for it, so it's usually surprising. There's definitely a perceived sense of danger. Whether or not the person is or not is irrelevant. If the brain thinks that you're in danger, it could be traumatizing. And it diminishes our coping skills. Many of you have sat there and you are with the doctors who gave the news, and the family is just sitting there and like they're not able to catch up to what they just said. And occasionally they'll ask back, wait, what did you say? And that's because they're so traumatized that their coping skills of processing, of thinking, of crying, it's just not caught up to them yet. So it could be a single event. It could be a connected series of events. It could be chronic and long-lasting. But one of my favorite explanations of what can be traumatic is when your internal resources are overwhelmed by your external experience. Many people have said this, maybe not many famous people, but many of the researchers would agree that sometimes our internal resources are depleted, and it can be for many reasons. If you think about yourself today and you think about yourself 10 years ago, maybe what you could do 10 years ago before maybe you were taking care of an ill parent is different. If you just gave birth and your child's still not used to sleeping the night, and so you're still up a lot of times during the night, your internal resources are going to be depleted. So this reminds us that I can't tell you what is traumatizing. You can't tell me what is traumatizing, but we can have this reality of respect that, maybe our internal resources are overwhelmed. And so here comes this experience and it is traumatizing. So there we are working, and we're exposed to clients and stories and conditions that highlight poverty, abuse, violence, grief, loss, pain, death. I mean, some of these are natural. some of these are human-made, and this inevitably has consequences. And what consequences you have depends on where you come from, depends on what stage of life you're in. It depends on what's going on with you, right? So as someone who has struggled with an eating disorder, my disordered eating gets worse as my exposure increases. So if for you, it might be sleeping. For someone else, it might be just really getting good at disassociating and not paying any attention. Some people are prone to depression. They're going to begin to isolate and then probably increase their chance of depression. I'll pause to say that someone asked, is there a phone number to call for just an audio? I don't think so. I will let Olivia Olivia, who is our TellSpan moderator, she might know the answer to that, but I don't believe so, not right now. In the future, I believe this will be recorded and sent out, or can be sent out. So that's, okay, it's being handled. So some physical consequences of what happens to people who have been exposed to a lot of trauma is they start having gastrointestinal problems, heart and pulmonary issues, ulcers, chronic exhaustion. The insomnia is really something that I've heard a lot, which if you can't sleep, you can't do the other things well. So naturally headaches, the sweats, sexual dysfunction is kind of a big one, certainly in couples. My expertise of what I've been looking at the last couple of years is what happens to our marriages as a result of trauma exposure. So there's a lot of sexual dysfunction of like not being able to get intimate with someone that you normally had been. Definitely erectile dysfunction as well as a result of the trauma exposure, and frequent illnesses. So you get sick more often. Lots of mental consequences. These is just a short list of some. People absolutely report higher rate of depression, higher rate of anxiety, certainly a lot of fear, a lot of guilt. We tend to not feel like we're doing anything. Like, what are we really doing? Like, what am I really accomplishing here? We inadvertently, whether we like it or not, we end up being angry and so having conflict with others. We have difficulty concentrating and lots of issues with safety and trust and control. So we might try to micromanage the things that maybe we would not have micromanaged. Maybe we're still fighting with our kid about their dirty bedroom, and maybe we would have let it go 5 years ago, but now we're just trying to control these things that are close to us. And having lots of trust issues. I did one study where the people who had a higher rate of exposure and who had been doing the work longer, what they showed was that they absolutely had a lot of more PTSD symptoms, which are some of these that I've already mentioned, these consequences. And they also had trouble trusting their partners to do things like order their food when they went to a restaurant or pick a vacation spot. They were also less likely to tell them how their day really went. So the basic question, how was your day, people were choosing not to answer. And in many cases, people were married to their spouses, or they were with their partners who could have probably handled it. But because of your own mental exhaustion, people were choosing to not let their partners into that space. And so you end up having a lot of trust issues. Let me pause right here and say, someone said that I'm a hospice chaplain and see a lot of death and dying. How would you distinguish the cumulative grief and chronic trauma? Oh, good. This might be a good segue, because I think I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different terminologies. And so we'll get back to this, because I think we'll see it. The other thing that will be important for you as a hospice chaplain is disenfranchised grief. So if you email me, I will send you a couple of articles about that, and so that I can give you about that, because I'm not going to really get into too much of disenfranchised grief. But that's definitely the kind of loss that you would experience in hospice that's not really out there. People don't notice that that's something that you're carrying. But let me answer some of these let me move on to some of the slides and see if it answers your other part of your question. So I've said this exposure is going to absolutely have consequences. Someone's asking, can I have the link or the name of the articles? I can send them to you. And you have my email information, and I really, really mean it. Feel free to find me on LinkedIn. Feel free to email me directly. You have my personal email, and I will absolutely send you any articles that I have available. So do that. One therapist said that our voices as therapists go with our clients. And then another therapist took it one more step further and said, that their voices go with us, and they absolutely, their stories change us. And so I want to just sit there for a little bit and kind of hold it that these are real things. They do change us. And we unfortunately, in my little opinion, and I'm just a Mexican immigrant, I don't know, but it seems to me like what we do in the United States is that we're all so rushed that we don't have time to admit that these things are touching us because we are obsessed with productivity and we are obsessed with outcomes, and we are competing for grants now because now that we have terminology, we can do it so much better. And so it puts us in an interesting position because then what ends up happening is that we don't have time to feel feelings. And we don't have time to acknowledge how stories can change us. We listen to others really, really well, but we put that somewhere and we're not really given time. And so this is an interesting thing. I always used to joke about this, but now I always say it with a little bit more of a tremble inside. The reason I have a job is because I live in a society where people are so bad at eye contact. They're so bad at being vulnerable. They're so bad at listening to one another that I get a paycheck to just do that. But there's no just, right? You guys know how hard that is. But the reason it's hard is not just because nobody else will do it. The reason it's hard is because something in me is touched by something in you. And so I am changed. And so I could keep talking about this, but I'm going to keep going so that I can keep giving you the information that you signed up for. So there's different words out there floating in space. Some researchers use these terms interchangeably. I mean, there are reasons to use one over the other. If you are maybe writing a dissertation, you certainly have to do different things. If you absolutely need to figure out what's going on with you and you want to sit with your therapist and go through this, then it matters because something is definitely different than others. But for all intents and purposes, unfortunately, they all lead to some pretty bad outcomes. So here's some definitions of what I think I can highlight for you that I found the most important, is that vicarious trauma, and vicarious trauma is also chronic stress or toxic stress and this. But here's the issue. Here's the dynamic or the detail that I think is most important about something called vicarious trauma. It's that it's A, cumulative, B, transformational of your inner experience, and that is a result of specifically engaging in traumatic stories. So that story that I mentioned of Felonious Grew, right, who says, I used to not feel this way, but now he was thinking humanity. There's no hope for humanity. Somebody said to me once, God is like the Easter Bunny. Okay, fine, you can think about that, or Santa Claus. You can think about the gift that you're going to get, but for real, it makes no sense. And that was absolutely not how they grew up, not even the things that they practiced, because both of those two people that I just mentioned were active participants in a church. And so they were participating, but they obviously saw the world differently. So when your brain starts to shift in the way you see things, that's your cognitive schema, or your belief system shifts as a result of engaging again and again and again in the traumatic experiences of others, that weighs on you, and that's called vicarious traumatization. Secondary traumatic stress was what it was called at first, and then Figley, who sort of was one of the pioneers in that work, said, you know what, that's too hard of a word. Let's just call it compassion fatigue. So these two terms are definitely interchangeable. And he said the natural and consequent behaviors and emotions resulting from knowing about these events that other people are experiencing. So that's because you're knowing that it's happening. You can absolutely have compassion fatigue from knowing all of the statistics that you're working with, or that maybe you're supervising chaplains and you're seeing what they're seeing. And so as you engage in the suffering of others, and you start changing your own behaviors, and you start not sleeping, and you start changing the way you treat people, that can be called secondary traumatic stress, or compassion fatigue. I added this little graphic at the bottom because I think it's really important to think of like how tired you are and how much you're running on empty. I'll pause to say that APC is going to send the articles that somebody asked for. So I'll send that, and I'll send a couple links. I'm going to put some information together, and they're going to be sending you a follow-up email. Some of the symptoms of compassion fatigue has the physical, emotional, spiritual exhaustion, right? So you keep giving. And so for some people, it's negative, intrusive thoughts. This is not an all-inclusive list, by the way. This is just what some people have certainly shared. The loss of hope, the anxiety, the sleep disturbances. Bigley said, compassion is being with the hurt person and doing the right thing as a result. Compassion stress is being able to let go of it. I'm just going to pause here, let you have a minute with that. Like, are you able to let go of it? That's a very important question, and one that is worth asking. Some of us are designed and have high tolerance for pain, and we're designed to keep on going and going, and we're just so strong. And then for people that might, speaking of intersectionality, which is not what this webinar is about, but if you are a person of color, if you are identify as a female, I mean, you have these spaces where you have these extra pressures. So are you able to let go of it? Have you even felt it? These are valid questions to pause and think about your own work. There's research that says that these are risk factors that increase compassion fatigue. So if we're a little bit on the older side, we all had a little bit more energy 10 years ago. If we have a high caseload, which is the truth for so many of us, so it's so sad. But if you have a lack of job experience, if all of a sudden they shift, you've been a trauma chaplain for forever, and all of a sudden the hospital realizes that palliative care is the way to go. Not that this has happened where you are, but maybe let's pretend now everybody's doing palliative care. And so you shift and you don't feel ready. You were not trained as a hospice chaplain. This isn't where your expertise lies. And all of a sudden you have a higher risk of compassion fatigue because you lack the job experience. You don't feel prepared for that. If you have previous trauma that you've not personally dealt with and sort of processed in the best way that you could have at the time, if you don't have a circle of support around you, if you have this repeated exposure, if you don't have good boundaries and you have some codependence with your clients, and multiple deaths in a very short period. I always think of my colleagues who do hospice care, and when there's these seasons where we see an increase in deaths, it's a little spooky because it's like real. And so when you see multiple deaths, it increases your risk factors. And then the regular work, like life balance of work, rest, and play. If there's a lack of that balance, and it's really, really hard. So I'm going to pause here and answer two of the things that have come in, or three. How do you not become jaded if you do just let go of it? How do you not become jaded? I think I'm going to talk about that, Kevin, in a little bit further down. And so there is a way to sort of discuss your own self-care. And so we're going to get to that. Do you make a distinction between empathy as a skill and compassion? Oh, where did it go? I'm sorry, guys. As an internal emotional resource. Empathy as a skill and compassion as an internal emotional resource. I will make a distinction because there is empathy training that you can do, which increases your resilience, and that's what some of the research says. So I think there is definitely a skill that's there. Your ability, some people have an innate ability to connect with others. And I think that's probably all of us that become chaplains. But compassion as an internal resource, it'll be an emotional resources internally if you learn to use self-compassion, which we are definitely going to talk about at the end of this, because that's part of how, to answer Kevin's question, you end up not becoming jaded, is if you practice self-compassion, and I'm going to talk about that for sure. Someone said, I'm a solo chaplain in a hospital. It's not so much about not being able to let go of it, but that it's all melds together. Absolutely, absolutely. And by yourself, you need to sort of get creative about how to create a support system that is effective for you, that is effective and healthy for the place that you work in as well. I know of it, like in the city of Philadelphia, we have this meeting every other month, which was kind of corny, and I wasn't going to go because I was like, oh my gosh, it's going to be a bunch of chaplains. What are they going to talk about? And so I went anyway out of someone who I knew was going, and I didn't want to let her down, a former CP student of ours. And I ended up being like, oh my God, these are my people. And then out of there, I remember there were conversations about others, right? So people who only did like hospice and they met for lunch once every other month. It's possible. And I think it melds together as also as a protective form for your brain. And these are related things, David, even if they don't sound like it, because our brain does protect us. And so some of the numbing, and there's neuroscience research that says our numbing is like our brain protecting us. And so our brain will actually help not let us so overly think, but if they do meld together, one way to prevent that is to sort of surround yourself by a support system. Let me go to Angela. It's really hard to have support at home because no one wants to talk about that. Yeah, I was the classic, when I would get home and how was your day? And I was like, it's fine. And then one day I erupted and was like, it was terrible. Of course it was terrible. I'm there for the worst part of people's lives. And then I had to apologize. But where do you go for support? So it depends. And we'll talk a little bit about that because we're going to talk about how do you build your own resilience, and that's different for different people, Angela, so we'll hopefully cover that. I can't tell you what will work for you because you're your own wonderful, unique person, and so we'll go ahead and cover that. And Joe, I will try to do my best to speak closer to the microphone. One important word that I want to highlight, which again, different people writing different articles online. I mean, some people use these words interchangeably, but the only reason I'm going to give you this word in this particular way is because for those of you, especially if you're working alone, when you work in a big institution, this is an important word to get to know to your administration. So when you have prolonged stress and frustration that results in all of these things, the physical, the emotional, the lack of motivation, you get burnt out. But the difference between these and the others in a lot of the research, and again, some people will use the terms interchangeably, but this one in particular, burnout, has to do with organizational stress. So those days when nobody else showed up and so your nurses are actually covered in more beds than they were supposed to, when all of a sudden they asked you to see all new inpatients when you used to only see referrals only as a chaplain. So if the organization, the workplace itself is producing stress, then once it produces a lot of stress, it can lead to burnout. And unfortunately, this leads to dissatisfaction, which then leads to work apathy. You don't really care. People just are not productive. People are always calling out sick. And, of course, the interpersonal difficulties. And why this matters differently is that the organizations, unfortunately, don't often care about our vicarious traumatization. It's hard to make a case for these other things. But when you talk to your institutions about burnout, you can put a dollar sign to it because there's research and there's tables out there that you can use to figure out what does it mean when you keep burning out your chaplains, your nurses, your doctors, and they keep leaving this job after you've invested $100,000 in these doctors, or $88,000 is what it takes to replace a nurse in the emergency room. I mean, you can come up with these numbers, which then can advocate. And so to me, this is the only one that has a really good antidote. The story that I've told about Felonious Grew, that dad who was really sad for his other kids, he had an antidote to this job burnout that he had where he was. He switched jobs. Was it easy? No. He had a whole family to support. It took a lot of intention to find the right job. He actually went to night shift, which he didn't want to do, but he ended up doing it because it just worked out. And after 2.5 years, he finally feels like he's reconnected with who he was before his time at the hospital where I met him. So, I mean, there is possibility to change. And although it's not easy, you only have one life to live, I think. So I think you're worth it. So it's worth to discuss how can you change the organization? How can you impact? And how can you protect yourself? Different models out there show you the various aspects of yourself and who you are. This is just one image that I found out there that I think it's really important because our body, our mind, our behavior, our emotions, they're all affected. And so we start seeing things, right? So I'm only just giving you a visual of some of the things that I hear other people have said are a part of what happens to us as a result of trauma exposure. Lots and lots of people report anxiety. And anxiety looks different in different cultures. I mean, sadness looks differently for so many of us. If we internalize it, we get angry, we get depressed. Someone defined depression as anger towards the self. There's lots of hopelessness, helplessness, moodiness, nightmares, and we do a lot of aggressive things sometimes, and we lash out in things that we wouldn't normally lash out. And for some people get quiet and they just emotionally numb. And the sadness is that you're not able to block out the good, the bad without blocking out the good. So if you emotionally numb the good and the bad, which of course leads to resentment and all sorts of sad things. And so it's not really how we were designed. And we know this because we do the work of chaplaincy. We sit with people and we wrestle with them, with their new diagnosis, with their new reality. And we want them to sort of sit there and be one with their truth. And we help them come to a place of peace with compassion. So you know this. But I think what the research keeps saying is that we don't know how to do this with ourselves. So I'm really sorry. I'm really sad. I'm also sad because this platform doesn't allow us to watch a video that is called Beyond the Cliff. It's a TED Talk that Laura does. It's phenomenal. I would not do it justice if I tried to tell it to you. But I will say from my own experience, which mirrors a little bit of hers, she has a story where she's in a beautiful place that is a cliff. And while everybody's just kind of soaking in the wonders, she ends up wondering like where the nearest trauma center is, because how many people have died as a result of standing on that cliff or accidentally or maybe suicidal. And I can resonate with that because I was sitting in therapy not long ago as I processed my own traumatic exposure. And my therapist said, well, let's think of a happy place. Have you ever done this before? And I'm like, oh, yeah, sure. And she said, what was your happy place? I said, the beach. And she was like, how does that feel now? And I said, pretty dangerous because there's so many people that drown. And I've been exposed to a lot of violence that happens and how they dispose bodies over there because I come from cartel country. It was so sad. And I could see in her face that I was scaring her, which was problematic in and of itself, but for another webinar. And I realized that nobody thinks that. Nobody thinks that. Just me. A friend of mine also told me the other day as she's driving to pick up her husband, and she missed the exit. She's like, oh, no. She was on the phone with me, and I was like, what happened? And she says, I missed the exit. My husband's going to be so mad. And I said, nobody's dead. Why is he going to be mad? Everything's fine. And she said, oh, girl, nobody thinks that but you. Nobody thinks like that. I was like, oh, that's true. And she's right. She's right. And so that reality, that response is absolutely connected to my own trauma exposure. But Laura has done a lot of work. This book called Trauma Stewardship gives a great guide to some of the things that happen as a result of trauma exposure. I did my best to put on the slide the picture of the 16 things that happen to us as a result of trauma exposure. I'll highlight a few. I think so many of them are, all of them really, are kind of self-explanatory. But I do feel that one of the things that happened a lot in the things that I was seeing was that people thought they had to stay till the end of everything because, like, they can't leave this patient. Like, they absolutely just cannot leave because they have this sense of, like, importance related to the work. Like, another victim of violence is going to come in and I need to be there for them. And so I never want to leave them. And so that's something that she termed this sense of grandiosity. That's one thing that I had to look up a little bit. The ability to embrace complexity, the way that looks is that somebody comes in and they come in a lot and we're like, oh my God, here's so-and-so. He's a frequent flyer and I can't stand but see him. He always has the same things to say. And we don't realize that the reason he has all the same things to say is because he's one of those people that fell through the cracks and is not on health care. And if he is, he doesn't have a health care navigator, so they can't give him his medication because he doesn't know how to process the paperwork, and they told him it was $900 for his medication. So of course he gets sick because nobody has $900 sitting out ready for some more medication. And so when there's people that are like, it's not that, he's just lazy, that's the inability to embrace complexity. When you're unable to think of how systemic oppression is actually a part, how there's white supremacy that are intrinsically a part of big institutions that are perpetuating violence and not doing enough to get rid of poverty in comprehensive ways. When you're unable to think of all of those things, that's your inability to embrace complexity. The other thing I saw a lot is this minimizing, right? Like when I said to my friend, okay, whatever, he's not dead, nobody's dead, it's fine. I completely minimized that, A, they had an appointment, B, they had an agreement. And I did that, right? So that was my own minimizing of her situation. I think the rest are pretty self-explanatory. And I think that, like, the other one that was really funny and very, this is all just full disclosure because I don't want to call anybody out, but, you know, people are talking to you, they're sharing you're a chaplain, so they're obviously sharing their heart, and you're thinking, oh, I got to make sure I stop at the grocery store because I got to get this and that before I go to soccer practice because I'm supposed to pick up the snacks. And those are dissociative moments, and you come back to it, and you're a wonderful trained chaplain, so you get right back on track. Nobody noticed that you missed a beat because you've got skills, you've been doing this, but you know you had your moment. You know you thought about your groceries and snack time. You know it. So those are like dissociative moments, not like big ones, just the little ones. When I sat with medical residents to talk about how they took care of themselves, most of them were like, were absolutely very honest about how, like, oh, I smoke a joint once I get home, or I drink. And so alcohol and addictions and drugs, I mean, that's just such a normal thing that we've normalized. And we have a lot of people that are working that are functional alcoholics as a result of their trauma exposure. So I'll pause, and I'm going to leave this up here while I'm looking at some of these questions. Does the research show that some people report a MACB sense of humor as the side effect of compassion fatigue? You mean like dark? I'm not sure, Kevin, but I think if you mean like dark sense of humor and cynicism, yes. Lots and lots of cynicism, because it comes from the sense of hopelessness. And so it's infectious. We learn it. We start comparing things that are, you know, different kind of like body parts having different kind of injuries in the ER. Oh, the dark, yes. So you clarified the dark sense of humor. Absolutely. And it's everywhere. everywhere. And as you know, as an immigrant, myself, I'm already learning a lot of phrases and a lot of words, and so I had to really expand my experience and my language and knowledge of things, because I was like, wait, what did you say? And so I had a confidant who would translate some of these things. But no, absolutely, the humor changes, and so a lot of it is the cynicism, which is a part of this circle, which is anger and fear. That are somewhat underneath that. That's what's behind that, right? To use the normal chaplain question of what's behind that. Let me read a little bit more. None of this sounds healthy, so how can we allow people to do their jobs without proper support and supervision? Great question, Mark. We allow it because people are so skilled that they still have good outcomes. Because we have technology that's advanced so much that people are actually able to not kill their patients because the machines are beeping, telling them it's time for their next dosage. And so that's how some of them do it. How do we do it? Well, that's for us to decide, right? I think our systems are not designed to protect us often. And I can't say what it is. I haven't studied that in depth. I've studied what happens to us and what we can do about it, but I think that's a great question. And I think if you're feeling what Mark is feeling, which is none of this sounds healthy, and how can we allow people to do their jobs, you're in the right track. We should be uncomfortable with how comfortable people are with this. It's absurd. And I think I heard a podcast recently about how we've lost our capacity to feel empathy. Not that we've lost it, but that there's a whole generation that's coming up, or that's currently in high school, and around the high school age, that they really don't understand why they have to care about other people. So they've started studying, and the researchers have said there has been a shift in what we as a society believed required or deserved our empathy, and where we are now. So I think culture's scarily changing. I think it's frightening. So I think what we can do is care about ourselves and care about others and model something different. Let's see. I'm trying to see if other questions. There's chats, and I want to encourage you guys to use the chats. I don't think they're all just for me. I think they're for all of us. And so take a look at that. Let me see. Are you seeking or getting help? This sounds tough. Thank you, Allison. Yes. And I'm laughing in a way because, yeah, I know this is tough. If it sounds tough, it's because it is tough. I am getting help, and I'm not here to talk about myself, but I'm happy to use myself as an example because I know I'm not the only one. Seeking help and getting help and having a consistent circle of support is vital. And what I need today is different from what I needed 1 year ago and what I needed 10 years ago and 15. So I've been doing trauma work for 15 years. So of course it's affected me. And it's a constant going back and checking and seeing how am I doing now? What do I need today? And we'll get to a little bit more of that for you guys, that I'm going to give you some ideas on how to maybe check in with yourselves. Let me see. I think when I watched a movie or read a book, I believe the worst possible things happen. Absolutely. That's true. I'm consistently watching things as well. And I think that's part of it. You're hypervigilant. That's what we're doing. We're so ready. I cannot see a scene with a car because I'm going to think of a car crash, because that's probably what I saw the most of. Is auto pedestrians or motor vehicle accidents in a trauma hospital. So absolutely. I'm afraid for my friends that are getting pregnant immediately because I can't count how many infant deaths I was a part of and had to do ceremonies with or engage in conversations. So absolutely, this is what happens. This is part of your schema changing as a result of the cumulative things, the transformation. This is the vicarious traumatization. So that's where we fall in. If you're like those of us that are watching a movie and reading a book and thinking the worst. Here's what the research says about chaplains in particular. We have this hyper altruistic tendency, And this propensity to not acknowledge that the same stress-induced symptoms that we recognize in other people. And so it's funny because people were like, well, what happens to chaplains? And it's like, well, the same thing. Like, we're not that different. I mean, this time I'm more prepared for that question, but because I researched chaplains. But no, we're the same. The same things happen to us. And this reality that we think it doesn't leaves us susceptible to different kinds of burnout symptoms and vicarious traumatization symptoms. And so that's what's sad. I mean, by definition, we join people's pain and help them, lead them, guide them, hold them on their way to hope. And so that's consistent exposure, for sure, for sure. And so the accumulation of the stressors or the single triggers, I mean, all of these things, they absolutely result in avoidance behavior and numbing and workaholic tendencies, and we want to do more because you have to fix this because you know how to fix it. You want to be a part of the solution, so you have difficulty concentrating, sleeping, eating, exercising. And so, you know, there's this thing that the Encyclopedia of Trauma that Faley had edited says is like a critical moment for chaplains. It's like when we are there with another person and this person starts having a spiritual crisis that's emulating our own. When that happens, and I'm not saying it happens to you, but I'm saying it happens to some of us, whenever that mirrors ours, there's a particularly overwhelming, chaotic feeling within us. And so there's incredible self-doubt, and people have left their own churches and made denominational choices based on those experiences. And so someone asked me, can you, I think just the difference between cynicism and normalizing tragedy. Oh, no, cynicism is unhealthy, and cynicism is filled with anger, and it's mean-spirited. And when you normalize tragedies, like the fact that the people of color are dying in a particular way, the fact that people of color are like filling the incarcerated spaces, like the fact that we know that and we're like, oh yeah, be careful. And we all have people of color who have children, we all have this conversation with our kids about how to behave around cops. That's us normalizing tragedy. We normalize it and we almost prepare our kids for it. But when we're saying to like that doctor who was like, well, if he didn't drink so much, he wouldn't be going down the stairs. Like or when they make jokes with one another, like this is what happens to you when you, whatever. Can't even think of an example. And I'm glad because that means I've had a little space between me and all the cynicism. But it's definitely mean-spirited and there's anger behind it. There's absolute anger and meanness behind it. And I think there is a sense of numbing that's different. Like, of course, we had our homicide. It was Friday. We always get homicides on Fridays. Is that our second one? Okay, we always get 3. So let's get 3, guys. So I think that would be like making some jokes. But I think that's still kind of cynical and angry below the surface. I don't know, Russell. Maybe that's like something that you can look into and like do another webinar on. Maybe this is your inspirational moment to engage in the research. I don't know. And that might just be that English is my second language, Russell. So I apologize for not being able to answer this or answer it well. I answered it, but maybe not well. I'm going to go to someone's asking that I point out that there are chaplains who are not Christian. Oh, you're absolutely right. This was just an image that I had. Liz, thank you for pointing that out. Liz says, that this image shows a Christian badge with a cross. So for sure, absolutely. Not all chaplains. I was just working with my limited amount of images, but excellent point. You see if I can scroll up to some of your other questions. Knowing it exists, this is Kevin saying, knowing that it exists is a huge start for Kevin. Yeah, listening and learning to his own thoughts helped him realize just how much it affected and set him on his journey to learn more and teach him better coping skills. Absolutely. No, there was no mistake when I think it was the 80s when they were like, knowledge is power, or like knowing is half the battle. I think knowing is like maybe 95% of the battle. Because I think we live in America. It's a first world country. We have access to a lot of things. We can absolutely be a part of our own successful healing and well-being if we want to be. If we want to be. In your studies, what was the most helpful to you to combat compassion fatigue? What was most helpful? I didn't do much studying on what to combat compassion fatigue. I looked at what happens to our marriages, particularly in me. If you mean like what did the research say? What combats compassion fatigue? We are definitely almost there, Elizabeth, so we will get there. I'll say it again in much more detail, but the work of self-compassion is basically right now, what I'm waving as my most important flag, which I'll explain more later. So more from the Encyclopedia of Trauma. There's some faith traditions that have divine judgment or divinely sanctioned pain, and so that absolutely affects how we see pain and suffering, both in others and in us. And so there are difficult questions that sometimes in some traditions we are very comfortable saying, and that's a mystery. And it just stays unanswered. But with that lack of answer, it leads to doubt, and it leads to the confidence eroding. If they constantly keep asking you, like, how can your God be able to, there's definitely consequences, how our belief systems are connected. So we have a lot going on inside of us, right? Even if we are able to parse things out, at the end of the day, all of these things, and this is just one combination of things, are happening inside us. And because these things are happening inside us, then there's absolutely bigger things happening between us. And so that's ultimately what we have to watch out for. Like what is happening that's different? What is happening between us that's different? Some research was done on something called empathic strain, which is what we end up doing, and so how we intellectualize, or we have this blank screen facade, and so we call that an empathic withdrawal. Or some people do this the repression thing. We're denying, we're distancing ourselves from the situations. I don't think this is more chaplains, because we tend to really be in it, but this is definitely what happens to practitioners more of like medical care and cops. This is the sense of disequilibrium, uncertainty, unmodulated affect. I have a lot of military service members in my family, and the fact that they're just so it just seems like their affect doesn't always match what's happening, and so that's part of their disequilibrium. That's a part of their reality and dependency. So we end up having we don't have good boundaries. We have over-involvement. We start to rescue people, and so there's that. But there's a little bit of hope, and so I'm glad we're finally getting to this. While I look at some of the questions, there is such a thing called vicarious resilience. And I want to scroll and look at this question that's below here. So I apologize, but I want to honor the questions that you guys are posting. This is Kathleen who's giving us a thought. What I think is a major concern is that caregivers need to identify is the need for self-care. Oh, for sure. It's not, I don't know what's happening. Oh, there it is. It's not a question of I don't think the question should be what does someone else do to restore themselves. I think the question should be how do you restore yourself? Amen. Where do you find your divine? What helps? Is it being with friends? Absolutely. Absolutely. No, you're on the right track, Kathleen, and you'll hear me echo this as well. Can we save questions till the end so we get through the material? Angela, yeah, we can do that. We're almost done, I think. No, I don't know. Let me say this about chaplains, about some of the resilience things. So chaplains do not report high compassion fatigue, but instead spoke of positive psychological growth following their exposures. That's a thing. And there's scales that measure post-traumatic growth. And what the post-traumatic growth questions are like, it's like, did you develop new interests? Did you have a greater feeling of self-resilience? Did you establish a new path in your life? Do you have a better appreciation for the days? I think a lot of times chaplains are able to do this, and those of you who have been doing this for a long time know that you get the question a lot of, how can you do this? And part of the response is your own post-traumatic growth, that it doesn't do to you what it does to others, it being the work that you do. It does not affect you the way it affects other people. And so that's post-traumatic growth. And so post-traumatic growth means that you increase your emotional well-being and your compassion and empathy for others. You increase your faith, your spiritual beliefs, your connection to the sacred. You increase your insight and understanding of self and others. You increase your spiritual practices, and you're more open to others. That's all part of the post-traumatic growth that chaplains spoke about. Vicarious resilience is, defined as a process about, what happens when we're learning about how other people overcame adversity. So when we're working with trauma survivors and we see how they were able to positively transform, or we saw the empowerment of clinicians through their empathy, they connected to people and their clients. There's research on this, and it's called vicarious resilience. A lot of it is not talking about chaplains. It's talking about people who worked with survivors and refugees in other countries, but it's out there. So what fosters vicarious resilience? Unconditionally supportive support networks outside of the survivor's family. This is, again, dealing with some of the research that came out of places of Colombia, where people had been working with therapists, and their clients were survivors, and they had been abducted at some point, human trafficking victims. And so once they worked with the therapist said, you know what, seeing that survivors' social networks was something that caused resilience. Protective personal characteristics of the person developed over time. So when they see other people develop, they were able to develop. They were also using psychological interventions that focused on building the client's strength, fostering a sense of personal control, and promoting and the development of authentic relationships. So this is key, because if some therapy here or in Europe has focused on what happened to you as a child, and where and there's different kinds of therapy modalities out there. So it's important to know that the kind of interventions that you are using with the people that you work with affect not only the progression of their therapy or the work with you, but also it affects what you're able to see in them. So if you're able to build the strength and not just bring awareness, and awareness of what happened in your childhood traumas and whatnot. So I think therapeutic interventions are important, and maybe that's more for those of you that do also therapy on the side. But I think a lot of components are important. And so if you have an empowerment model, if you have the idea of you're building self-resilience and that you want to build it in your clients, and that's part of the interventions that will help you see the growth in them, which causes growth in you. Research has shown that practitioners gain an understanding that people can transform experiences. I've always been impressed when I've worked with survivors, the surviving family of homicide victims, and how people stand up, how there's always a pillar in these families that sort of stands up and gathers them around, or even leads in the prayer at the end while they all walk out of the hospital bed, the unit, and sort of carry on with their lives. It's amazing. It's amazing what you can see and the strength that you can see in other people. You've seen research has also been able to see that you develop more realistic and less individualistic worldviews. You gain a deeper appreciation for your own lives. I'll add your own privileges, right? Your ability, your ableisms, your ability to walk, your ability to communicate verbally, your ability to call your family, see your family. And so you end up also gaining a greater sensitivity to prejudices. Practitioners also reported increased empathy and compassion, a profound sense of meaning. And I think that I've heard this a lot from chaplains as well when I've had conversations at APC conferences and whatnot. I mean, this is what we do. We do, and it has such profound meaning. We do this because it's a calling from maybe a higher being, right? This is why you were created. Practitioners also reported an increased knowledge and awareness of issues. Because our clients teach us things. There has been reported enhanced self-esteem and, of course, enhanced self-esteem and increased sense of hope, and that people endure and overcome trauma. What I stopped myself from saying is, like, we don't get into this work because we want to enhance our own self-esteem because of their sad stories, but we do end up feeling a sense of purpose. And when we feel that there is meaning and purpose in our lives, then we'll feel a lot better. One of our very own did a webinar a couple years ago. I don't recall when, but he talked about resilience factors that we should build in our patients and our families. And I believe, and I hope that if he's here and I'm not butchering his research, but I believe the research that he presented said was, if we build these things up in people, then their lows are not so long lasting. So will they be sad when their loved one dies? Of course. But if these resilience factors have been working behind the scenes, then instead of being depressed for 3 months, they'll be really sad for 1. And it won't be depression, it will be sadness, and they'll deal with grief differently. And so these resilience factors are echoed in the research all over the place. This is a sign that I had in my office, and for the years that I was in a hospital and had CP students come through, so many students made copies of this. And all I had was literally a picture from an APC webinar, and I had it on my wall. It was so important. It was so important. We won't fall as low as we could if we build these things up. So it's all about prevention. The research says, that sociologists have definitely said, all of our beliefs are dynamic and shifting with context. And so although we are designed to feel empathy, we definitely need to pay attention to what we're letting in and what we're listening to and what we're choosing to connect to. Neuroscience shows that our brain shifts. Like, there's literally changes in our neuroplasticity when we are exposed to the pain of others as well as the joy of others. But so we want to be mindful that our brain is shifting. And so what helps us do it in a healthy way is when we have empathy training and compassion training. And so that's really, really important. One of the things that helps prevent the negative effects is good supervision. So for those of you that are supervising, this is really, really important. If the people that you supervise feel that they can come to you and that you're being an effective leader to them, it's vital. It's vital to preventing negative effects. For those of you that are like, I'm by myself, what do I do? You can hire supervisors outside of your work. You can hire a life coach to help you stay in check. You can have a peer group that you help to create in the city where you might be. There's a way for you to have this good supervision. So training and preparation. You are listening to an APC webinar. This is you being a part of how to prevent your own negative effects of trauma exposure, because when you start learning about various topics, you won't feel unprepared with cases or clients or experiences. So this is absolutely this proactive space that you're taking, and it's wonderful. Good interdisciplinary teams, period. When you're new to a group, when you're new to the palliative care team because they just formed it last year because they realize how much money and revenue comes in from that, building good interdisciplinary teams matters. So if you show up to your Wednesday meetings with a little bit of, something that's good in nutrition, like a bag of nuts to share during your meetings, you're building the team. So when you have good teams, people have less negative effects. And there's positive religious coping in the research. There's negative ones too, but I'm not here to highlight those. I'm here to highlight the positive ones. And so the positive things is when you practice forgiveness, when you seek spiritual support, when you practice your own spiritual connections, when you have religious purification rituals that you either incorporate from your own tradition or borrow from others. And those are ways to help prevent the negative space. I always incorporated rituals that were just mine. Every time I was done with a particular case, I would go wash my hands very slowly and bless and release my clients, my families, my patients. And it was just vital. And if I got home and thought, wait, did I wash my hands? I'd immediately go wash my hands first before I engaged anyone. In my own house, because it's part of that purification piece that I think is so vital and so necessary. And apparently the research says it helps prevent negative effects. So, and finally, something I've already mentioned a couple of times, self-compassion and cultivating compassion training. So compassion cultivation training, which I will tell you a little bit more about as we go forward. I know someone said, can we please get through this? And I want to honor that request, but I also am very aware that, you know, my Latin American roots say that we have to be in dialogue. So I have to at least give it a little bit of attention to these boxes below. And you are all welcome. Again, I've said it again and again. I'll say it one more time. You're welcome to email me. Don't be mad at APC because I pause so much in order to engage questions, but call me, email me. We'll set up a time, a Zoom session. We'll hash this out. You will get all that I can share with you as a result of our conversation. I don't want you to feel like you were gypped. What do I mean by brain shifting? So that's a term that the research used a little bit of it. I think I used it more. Our brain changes. Our brain changes, our neuroplasticity, the ways in which our brains make connections is changing depending on different things. So if we give it drugs, it moves in a particular way. If we have injuries, they shut down in a particular way. So what I mean by brain shifting is what I'm saying is I'm trying to highlight that when you have empathic connections with others, they can track this in an MRI. They can look at what is happening in your brain and how you're expanding certain areas. And that's what I mean by brain shifting. So speaking of shifting, thank you, Luz. The important thing about this work that I've realized is that we need to switch gears. The way healthcare has switched gears, and we need to do interventions instead of instead of just doing the interventions, we need to enhance our prevention. So just the way that corporate companies are no longer giving you great medical benefits. Sometimes what they do is give you really high deductibles, but a free gym membership because they're doing prevention. Well, it's the same thing with us. And so here are some of the things that I would say are the ABCs of self-care, right? Awareness, balance, and connection. These three things to me and the work that I've been doing have seemed to be so vital. And so awareness of your own tolerance level, awareness of what you can handle, your own boundaries, your own needs, your feelings. Do you need to be around people versus not around people? There's so many tools for you to gain awareness about yourself. There's so many tests online. There's Myers-Briggs. There's an Enneagram. There's the colors of the gold and the yellow, the blue and the green. There's so many things out there so that you can figure out who you are and how you operate, right? And how do you feel yourself? How does your body feel when you eat certain things? Becoming so aware is vital. You need to know your own needs. You need to know your own emotional needs, your sensation. Oh, Steven Spidel, look at you. You're who I quoted. Sorry, everyone, but he made a comment in the chat box, and I want to give credit where credit is due for the resilience training. He is here. What are the implications for chaplaincy training? Absolutely. And I know I'm pausing, so I apologize that I'm mid-track, but I want to engage this question. Training helps. The more CPE units people have, the more training they have. And so although I haven't seen a specific research out there that did specifically how many units compared to that, what the research would compel us to believe is that if their people are more trained, they absolutely are better capable of handling things and will have lower compassion risk or compassion fatigue risk. So that would be what I think it would say, although the research isn't technically out there. And it depends on the content of the training, Stephen. So I would suspect I know that we can train in self-compassion, we can train in empathy skills, which I mentioned earlier, and that did show like better coping and higher quality of life index when that was measured. So there's definitely a connection. So sorry for the segue. Back to my ABCs: awareness. I've already talked about balance. So harmonizing your work and your life and your play. I know that life is bizarre, and sometimes it gets a little more hectic in one area, and sometimes it gets a little more hectic in another. Sometimes work is just really complex because you have Joint Commission coming to your hospital to check things out, or sometimes home gets really hectic because you're pregnant and you're about to give birth and you're prepping your home. And so work and home and play and how all these things, your kids, if you have kids that are teenagers, I mean, you have to figure out how to do this better. And so I think harmonizing work and play and life and harmonizing life feels better than balancing. Balancing feels like there's a right and a wrong because you're in balance versus out of balance. But I think harmonizing feels more movable. And connection to like life-giving individuals. Not everybody that we know is life-giving. And people who know the work that we do absolutely always, they will come to you with questions. So not everybody's life-giving. In your life, you might actually only have 4 or 5 people who are always consistently life-giving. So those connections are vital. Connecting to a bigger purpose and meaning. Allow for at least one deep connection, emotional connection with an individual who can be totally 100% there for you, 100%. Someone who knows the real you. In our communities of color, we talk about having representatives that we send out into the world, but having ourselves with one another. And so you need to know who knows you and not your representative. Having those connections and allowing for them. Maybe you're an introvert, and so all you really need is like a consistent text message buddy that you like check in with once a week. To just be like, hey, friend, are you okay? Just checking in. And that's all you need. And some of you are extroverts and really need a lot of companionship and people to feel energized. And so making sure that, you know what, Thursdays is non-negotiable. You always check in around the water cooler. So your self-care. True self-care is completely about you. Several people mentioned it in the chat box, right? Like, how do you take care of you is completely about you. It does not need to benefit anybody else. It's completely based on your preferences and context, what you can do. It gives you life and energy. It gives you so much satisfaction. And because you feel satisfied in your own existence, you end up spilling over, and your satisfaction and happiness and contentment flows into other parts of your life. And so it needs to be something that hurts you when you lose it, right? So if you don't like journaling, you're not going to miss it if you don't do it for 6 months. But if you're someone who loves journaling, that might be a good thing to try as part of your own self-care, having a gratitude journal, things like that. You know, sometimes we have, loud kids, and all you have is like 3 minutes in the bathroom before they all barge in there and try to get into the bath with you, and that happens. And so enjoy those moments, right? Whether they're 30 seconds or whether they're 5 minutes, but true self-care needs to be ongoing. Self-care needs to be, think about your values, your context, think holistically. These are various images that I think spoke to how different people view and understand the human existence, right? Some places I've been exploring Ayurveda, which is basically the sister science to yoga that has to do with like our body makeup and eating according to your body makeup. I mean, you've got to really think outside of the box.
Thank you all for your patience. One moment as we reconnect our speaker. We now have our speaker back with us. Please continue.
Sorry, guys. Not sure what happened, but I was encouraging you to think holistically and use whatever tradition and cultures that might be able to expand the way you think about it. We care a lot about our bodies, but our bodies are connected to the spirit, and the spirit is maybe, if you believe this, connected to the community, and the community is connected to the environment. So think as outside of the box as you can as you think about your own well-being and who you are as a whole human. So for me, what I've been doing with people as their chaplain is sort of just sitting with them and exploring these 4 spaces of self-care. And I am, again, it could be much more complex than this, but this is what I've been doing, right? So I want to make sure that nobody forgets that they have these, at least these 4 aspects that they can connect to themselves. And so what I asked them to create is a little self-care plan. And I drew this out with Excel, put it on a couple pieces of paper, and I carried them in my pocket at all times. And I would ask them, like, what do you do that's spiritually filling? What do you do that's mentally filling and physically filling and emotionally filling? And what can you do at home? And what can you do at work? And what can you do anywhere? Obviously, you can't have a bubble bath with wine and candles at work, but you can do that at home. And so you would put that there. Can you do some deep breathing? Can you do that anywhere? Probably. Of course, if you're the kind of person that doesn't take time to go drink water or go to the bathroom, then just going to the bathroom is part of your physical self-care. So this is simple. It's very simple, but it's at least something. Everybody has 30 seconds. We might feel like we don't, but we all have it. And 30 seconds of deep breathing would really, really go a long way. Now I get to self-compassion. I'm really excited to share a little bit of the self-compassion research that was out there, because what it gives us is a lot of information on what can happen. And so I don't want to oversimplify it. I will send out information so that you can learn more about self-compassion. There was research done on how self-compassion for chaplains, how it worked, and mindful self-compassion helped chaplains. And so that's what I wanted to share with you before our time is done and we get into the Q&A. But so what we mean by self-compassion, or what the research suggests by self-compassion, is these 3 things are like the characteristics and the components about self-compassion. Number 1, self-kindness versus self-judgment. So what that means is, like, instead of being tough on yourself and having such harsh opinions about what happens to you or where you're supposed to be, and it's just definitely having some self-kindness about how you integrate things. So the idea that you're not your own opponent. You don't have to beat yourself up. You can just loosen up. In some places, the self-criticism, some places they talk about, like, the inner critic. Like, our inner critic has a megaphone and it is so loud. And so learning to just be aware that, like, I don't need to be so mean to myself. I don't need to have such high expectations that are actually not realistic at all. So being able to have self-kindness. The feeling of common humanity versus human isolation. This one, you've all seen it. Like, when you have had a great day, everything's going fine, but then someone tells you about something that you did that was, less than perfect. Maybe you rubbed someone the wrong way. Maybe what you said was not ideal. Maybe you had a bad evaluation and your boss told you that you did something wrong. So the idea that you're like, oh my gosh, I'm a horrible person, I can't believe I did that, that is a way to isolate yourself from all humanity. The opposite of that is to say, you know what, it's normal. It's totally normal. Did I do that? I'm so sorry that I did that. You know what? I apologize. That was not my intention, without saying I am a horrible person. Or I don't share in the humanity, to be able to say, yeah, sometimes that one time I got a bad evaluation. Yep. Doesn't make me a failure. I'm not the only one who failed. I had a bad evaluation, and that just makes me normal. In the Christian context, we're reminded that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Like, it's okay. That just means you're human. So that's part of this idea of sharing humanity. And mindfulness over as opposed to over-identification. So this approach that, we just stay completely in touch with what we're doing and just kind of going over and over in our mind with the moment of that moment where we failed, and we stay in judgment about something that maybe had happened. But we have to train our brain. We have to train our brain to be mindful and just kind of accept where you are, accept your reality. If there are symptoms that are happening for you, like your heart's racing, then just stop and feel it and notice it, and be mindful of what you're doing. This was really important because the studies that they did on self-compassion, and what they did is that they taught people how to be self-compassionate and how to be more kind to one another and stuff. That definitely said that when you're able to increase your self-compassion, then you would have a lower rate of compassion fatigue and life satisfaction. So if you were able to have high self-kindness, then you would be able to just be able to experience life. And so self-compassion is vital, and it leads carers to take time off, sleep more, eat well, be less drained. So we want to increase our self-compassion so that you're able to just decrease your compassion fatigue. And I apologize because that's a typo in the middle bullet there. So you want to increase, if you increase self-compassion, you will decrease your compassion fatigue. That's what that's supposed to read. I think we're almost done. There's research that says that compassion training, compassion cultivation training, which is where I was able to grab some of these last things that I'm going to share with you. And they're basic tips in order to help us understand and embrace our compassion towards self. And so in order to decrease compassion fatigue, increase compassion satisfaction, and they're healthy eating, having good sleep hygiene, so not having televisions and not going to bed with a lot of devices next to you, your computers, your cell phones, all these things, sleeping at the same time. You can Google good sleep hygiene, having regular aerobic exercise, having regular social activities. Even for those of us that are introverts, we still have to, just get connected into the universe every once in a while, in order to remind ourselves of our shared humanity. Engaging in creative activities and hobbies. And I know some people are like, I'm too stressed to be doing that, but the reality is part of your brain is not being activated if you don't ever engage the creativity that you could do. Spiritual practices is important. Professional enrichments, you're already doing one of them, right? Sitting through a webinar, doing things that will enrich you and enhance who you are as a professional, as a mother, as a father, as a loved one, being your best version of yourself. Doing mindfulness, obviously, and I already mentioned self-compassion. So I'll leave it. I'm going to leave it on this, but I think I'll leave it on that so that you guys can take notes of that. And at this point, open it up to more questions. And I think, Olivia, if you can help me with some of the questions, I think our other moderator has been able to sort of pay attention to the different things that maybe I have missed. So I'd like to maybe invite Olivia back to help me moderate this piece.
Thank you. We have reached time for today's presentation, but we will continue for just a few moments to address any final questions. Please remember to type your questions into the Q&A area located on the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And I believe where we have ended with our questions that you have addressed is, our next one is, haven't you heard of CPE fatigue too?
I'm sure it's true. I did not encounter that in my research. I'm going to go back to leave my information on there so that if you guys need to reach me, you can.
Thank you. Our next question thanks you for the presentation and also asks if you could share a little bit about your cultural background.
Oh, of course. I am Mexican and I immigrated here 15 years ago. And I've been working particularly with communities of color. Is that what that person meant? I'm not sure, but my work background has been with sexual assault victims. I shifted out of that and went into hospital chaplaincy in the emergency room. And then right now I am in the middle of a 2-year sabbatical that I took what I mean by that is I took a contract job somewhere that's got me out of trauma in order to sort of reassess myself and reconnect with myself. And I want to continue the work of trauma, but I don't think I can do it without a sabbatical. And so I created my own sabbatical since it wasn't really out there for chaplains.
Thank you. And that is exactly what the attendee meant.
Oh, good.
Our next question, do you have any resources specific to prison chaplaincy? Some of our issues are a little different from other types of chaplaincies.
Not at my fingertips, but I can certainly find some. And I'm making a note to look for some, and I'll send it to you in my massive email that I'm supposed to send you, Olivia, at APC.
Thank you. There was also a question about slides, which I believe will be included with the content that we'll be sending along.
Okay.
All right. And at this time, that appears to be our final question. So I will turn it back to you, Alexandra, for any final remarks.
Just thank you. And thank you for your time. I'm purposely leaving my information there. Really encourage you to reach out if there's anything that was stone that was left unturned. I'm happy to turn it with you through a session, a conversation, email, whatever works. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for your attention. This concludes today's presentation. All participants may now disconnect.